The note should have been effortless. Ella Fitzgerald had sung it 1,000 times before. A simple climb from middle C to the octave above, the kind of interval that felt as natural as breathing. But on this particular night in a small Los Angeles jazz club, something happened that had never happened before in her entire career. The note didn't come. Her voice, the instrument that had never failed her, the gift that had carried her from poverty to stages across America, simply stopped working. 300 people sat in stunned silence as Ella Fitzgerald stood frozen at the microphone, her mouth open, no sound emerging except the faint rasp of air. The band behind her faltered, uncertain whether to continue or stop. And Ella, for the first time in her professional life, felt pure terror. This is the story of the night everything changed. Not because of triumph, but because of failure. Not because perfection finally arrived, but because it shattered completely. And what happened in the next 60 seconds would transform not just Ella Fitzgerald's career, but the entire language of jazz vocal performance. Before we step into that moment of crisis, here's the question that pulls everything into focus. What happens when the one thing you've always been able to trust betrays you in front of everyone who's watching? When your greatest strength becomes your vulnerability? When excellence meets its breaking point? Ella Fitzgerald knew. And what she did with that knowledge created something the world had never heard before. Ella Fitzgerald's voice was a miracle, and everyone who heard it understood that immediately. From the moment she'd won the Apollo Theater Amateur Night Competition at 17, scared and uncertain but undeniably extraordinary, her vocal ability had been the one constant in a life marked by instability and struggle. She'd been orphaned young, raised in difficult circumstances, survived poverty and uncertainty that would have crushed someone with less resilience. But through all of it, her voice remained perfect. 3 octaves of pure clarity. Perfect pitch that seemed almost supernatural. A warmth and precision that made every song feel both technically flawless and deeply emotional. By 1955, at 38 years old, Ella had established herself as one of the premier jazz vocalists in America. She'd recorded dozens of albums, performed in the most prestigious venues, won the respect of musicians who understood just how difficult her casual-sounding perfection actually was. But here's what most people didn't understand about Ella's voice. It wasn't just talent, it was safety. In a world that had been unpredictable and often cruel, her voice was the one thing she could absolutely control. When everything else in her life felt uncertain, she could open her mouth and produce something beautiful. When she felt powerless, her voice gave her agency. When she felt invisible, her voice made her impossible to ignore. Her entire identity, her sense of worth, her understanding of her place in the world, all of it rested on one foundation: the certainty that her voice would always be there when she needed it. Now here's what happened on that October night in 1955, a night that started like hundreds of others, a night that should have been routine, a night that became the most terrifying and transformative experience of Ella's career. The venue was the Tiffany Club on 8th Street in Los Angeles, a mid-sized jazz room with good acoustics and a loyal audience. Not Carnegie Hall, but respectable. The kind of place where serious jazz fans came to hear music performed at the highest level, without the formality of concert halls. Ella had performed there before. She knew the room, knew the sound, felt comfortable on that stage. She'd arrived early, as always, to warm up and settle her nerves. The warm-up had gone perfectly. Her voice felt strong, flexible, ready for the 2-hour set ahead. The band that night was excellent. Piano, bass, drums, all musicians she'd worked with before. The set list was familiar, a mix of standards and newer arrangements that showcased her range and improvisational skill. Everything was in place for another successful performance. The club filled up steadily. By showtime, every seat was taken, with people standing along the back wall. 300 people who'd paid to hear Ella Fitzgerald sing. 300 people expecting excellence, because Ella Fitzgerald never delivered anything less. She walked on stage to warm applause, took her place at the microphone, smiled at the audience with the gracious warmth that had become part of her public persona. The band started the intro to A Tasket, one of her signature songs, one she'd sung so many times she could perform it in her sleep. The first verse went perfectly. Her voice was warm and clear, moving through the playful melody with the ease that made difficult singing sound effortless. The audience relaxed into that familiar pleasure of hearing something done exactly right. Second verse, still perfect. Ella felt confident, comfortable, in that flow state where performance stops being work and becomes pure expression. And then, midway through the third verse, on a note that should have been absolutely simple, something went wrong. The note started normally, but as she tried to sustain it, she felt a strange sensation in her throat. Not pain exactly, but a sudden restriction, like something had closed off. She tried to push through it, to force the note out through whatever obstruction had appeared. Nothing came except a thin, strained sound that wasn't her voice at all. She stopped singing. The band, confused, continued for 2 more bars before trailing off into silence. The audience stirred uncomfortably. Something was wrong. Ella Fitzgerald didn't stop mid-song. Ella Fitzgerald's voice didn't fail. Ella stood at the microphone, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She tried to swallow, tried to clear whatever was blocking her throat. She gestured to the band to continue, to give her the intro again. She'd recover. She had to recover. Her voice never failed. The piano started the verse over. Ella took a breath, opened her mouth, and tried to sing the same note that had betrayed her moments before. Nothing. Not even the strained sound from before. Just air and a terrible rasping quality that sounded nothing like Ella Fitzgerald. 300 people sat in absolute silence, watching one of the greatest vocalists in America stand helpless at a microphone, unable to produce a single note. And Ella felt something she'd never experienced on stage before. Pure, overwhelming panic. Her mind raced through possibilities. Was she sick? Had she damaged her vocal cords somehow? Was this temporary or permanent? Would her voice come back tonight, tomorrow, ever? Every terrifying question crashed through her consciousness in the space of seconds. But underneath the panic was something even more frightening. The realization that her entire sense of self, her entire identity, was built on something that could apparently just disappear without warning. If she couldn't sing, who was she? What did she have? What was left? The band had stopped again. The drummer, sensing disaster, looked at the piano player, who looked back with equal uncertainty. Should they keep trying? Should they stop the show? Should someone help? Ella stood frozen, caught between the urge to run off stage and the professional obligation to somehow salvage this situation. She could feel 300 pairs of eyes on her, watching her fail at the one thing she was supposed to be incapable of failing at. And in that moment of absolute crisis, something unexpected happened. Not a solution, not a recovery, but a decision. If her voice wouldn't work the way it was supposed to, then she'd have to find a different way to use it. She turned to the band and in a hoarse whisper that the audience couldn't hear said, "Just keep the rhythm going. Bass and drums, I'll figure something out." The bass player and drummer exchanged glances, then started a simple walking bass line with a steady drum pattern. No melody, just rhythm. A foundation for something that didn't exist yet. Ella closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the rhythm, feeling the panic recede just slightly as she focused on the music rather than her failure. She couldn't sing words. She couldn't produce the clean, sustained notes her voice normally created effortlessly. But she could make sounds. And if those sounds followed the rhythm, stayed in key, had intention behind them, maybe that would be enough to survive the next few minutes until her voice either came back, or she could escape off stage with some shred of dignity intact. She opened her mouth and instead of trying to sing a melody, let out a rhythmic phrase. Bop bop a doo bop. Nonsense syllables, but rhythmically precise, landing exactly on the beat the bass was laying down. The sound that emerged wasn't her normal voice. It was rougher, more percussive, almost instrumental in quality. But it worked. It was music, even if it wasn't what anyone had expected. The audience, which had been holding its collective breath in anxious anticipation, released a small murmur. Not applause, not quite understanding, but relief that something was happening instead of the terrible silence. Ella tried another phrase. Shooby-doo-wah-dat. Different rhythm, different melodic contour, but still matching the bass line, still musical despite being wordless. And something strange started to happen. The limitation, the inability to produce her normal sound, forced her to approach music from a completely different angle. She wasn't singing a song anymore. She was creating rhythm and melody in real time using her voice as a percussion instrument, a horn, anything except what it normally was. The piano player, understanding what Ella was attempting, started adding chordal punctuation underneath her improvised vocal sounds. The drummer increased the energy slightly, giving her more rhythmic material to work with. And Ella, released from the pressure of perfection, released from the need to produce the flawless sustained notes everyone expected, started to explore what her compromised voice could actually do in this moment. She created syncopated rhythms. She imitated the sound of a trumpet, a saxophone, a trombone. She built melodic phrases out of pure sound without a single actual word. And as she did this, something unexpected emerged. Joy. Not the joy of performance going according to plan, but the deeper joy of pure creation. Of discovering something new in the moment. Of turning disaster into exploration. The audience began to understand that they weren't witnessing a failure anymore. They were witnessing something entirely new. Something that had never existed before this moment. Something being born out of necessity and courage and desperation transformed into art. Ella's phrases became more complex. She started to build conversation between her voice and the instruments. The saxophone player joined in, trading phrases with her. When he played a melodic line, she'd answer with a vocal phrase that echoed and transformed his idea. When she created a rhythmic pattern, he'd pick it up and elaborate on it. What had started as crisis management was becoming a new form of jazz performance. Vocal improvisation that didn't rely on lyrics or traditional melody. Pure sound used as rhythm and color and texture and emotion. The band was fully engaged now, all of them understanding that something special was happening. They weren't just backing a singer anymore. They were participating in a collective improvisation where Ella's voice was functioning like another horn in the ensemble. Ella felt her panic transforming into something else. Not confidence exactly, but a kind of fierce determination. Her voice hadn't come back. The notes still wouldn't sustain the way they normally did. But she'd found a way to make music anyway. A way that felt raw and immediate and more honest than many of her perfectly executed performances. She pushed further. Created phrases that deliberately used the roughness in her voice as a texture, rather than trying to hide it. Explored the percussive attack of consonant sounds. Built entire melodic structures out of nothing but do-do-dat-dat-bop-bop-skia. And the audience, which had come expecting to hear Ella Fitzgerald sing beautiful standards, found themselves witnessing the invention of something that would eventually be called scat singing in its fully realized form. Ella wasn't the first person to ever use nonsense syllables in jazz. Louis Armstrong had done it. Others had experimented with it. But what Ella did that night, forced by her voice's failure to find a new way to create music, took the technique to a completely different level. She demonstrated that a voice could improvise with the same freedom and complexity as any instrument. That lyrics weren't necessary for vocal music to carry emotion and meaning. That limitation could become liberation if you were brave enough to explore what was possible instead of mourning what was lost. The set that was supposed to last 2 hours ended after 45 minutes. Not because Ella gave up, but because she'd pushed her compromised voice to its absolute limit and couldn't continue without risking permanent damage. When she finally signaled the band to end, the audience erupted into applause that was different from normal applause. Not the polite appreciation for excellence delivered as expected, but the wild enthusiasm of people who'd witnessed something unprecedented. Something they'd tell others about. Something that felt historic even in the moment it was happening. Ella took her bow, smiled at the audience, and walked off stage on shaking legs. The moment she was out of sight, she collapsed into a chair in the tiny backstage area and started to cry. Not from relief that she'd survived, though there was some of that. Not from joy at the audience's response, though she'd heard their enthusiasm. But from the terrifying understanding that the thing she'd relied on, the perfection she'd built her entire identity around, could vanish without warning, and that she'd have to figure out who she was, and how to make music in a world where that perfection couldn't be guaranteed. Her manager found her there, shaking and crying, and immediately called a doctor. The diagnosis was vocal strain. Nothing permanent, likely caused by a combination of overuse and a minor respiratory infection she hadn't noticed. Rest and proper treatment would restore her voice fully within a week. But something had changed that couldn't be restored by rest. Ella had discovered that her voice, even when it failed, could still make music. That perfection wasn't the only path to artistic truth. That sometimes the most important discoveries come from being forced to abandon what you do well and explore what you've never tried before. When her voice did come back, fully restored to its perfect clarity and range, Ella didn't just return to performing exactly as she had before. She integrated what she'd learned that night. She started incorporating scat singing into her performances deliberately, not as an emergency measure, but as a legitimate artistic choice. She explored the same improvisational freedom she discovered through necessity, but now from a place of strength rather than desperation. And audiences noticed. The critics noticed. Other musicians noticed. Ella Fitzgerald was evolving from a singer of extraordinary technical perfection into something more. An improviser. An innovator. Someone who could use her voice in ways that had never been fully explored before. The technique she'd stumbled into that October night became her signature. The Ella Fitzgerald songbooks, her legendary interpretations of the Great American Songbook, were brilliant. But her scat singing, her ability to improvise vocal melodies with the complexity and sophistication of the greatest jazz instrumentalists, that became the thing that separated her from every other vocalist of her generation. She would later say in interviews that the night her voice failed was the night she truly became an artist rather than just a performer. That the terror of limitation forced her to discover possibilities she would never have explored if everything had continued working perfectly. But here's the deeper truth that Ella herself struggled to articulate fully. That night wasn't just about technique or innovation. It was about identity. About what happens when the thing that defines you proves unreliable. About who you are when your greatest strength fails. Ella had built her entire sense of self around vocal perfection. Around being the one who never made mistakes, never hit wrong notes, never disappointed. And when that perfection shattered, she had two choices. She could panic and let the failure define her. Or, She could find a way to create something meaningful, even in the midst of limitation. She chose creation, and in doing so, she demonstrated something that resonated far beyond music. That our greatest innovations often come not from our strengths operating perfectly, but from our weaknesses forcing us to think differently. That failure, when met with courage and creativity, can become the foundation for breakthroughs that success would never produce. The musicians who were on stage with Ella that night told the story for years afterward, how they watched her transform terror into exploration in real time. How they participated in the birth of something new. How the worst moment of her career became the most important. Other vocalists heard about what happened and started experimenting with similar techniques. Scat singing evolved from a novelty into a legitimate form of jazz vocal expression. And while others contributed to that evolution, Ella's approach, born from that night of crisis, remained the gold standard. The proof that a voice could be as improvisationally sophisticated as any instrument. But for Ella personally, the legacy of that night went even deeper. She learned that she was more than just the sum of her technical abilities, that her artistry wasn't contingent on perfection, that she could survive failure and even transform it into something valuable. This understanding changed how she approached performance for the rest of her career. She became more willing to take risks, to experiment, to explore musical territories that weren't guaranteed to work perfectly. The fearlessness that her early perfection had actually prevented, her later willingness to be imperfect in service of expression enabled. Years later, long after the night at the Tiffany Club had become legend, Ella recorded some of her most celebrated work. The songbook series, her collaborations with Louis Armstrong, her live performances that captured her improvisational genius at its peak. All of it carried traces of what she'd learned when her voice stopped working. Audiences who heard those later performances heard not just technical excellence, but courage. The willingness to explore, to play, to create in real time without the safety net of perfect preparation. They heard an artist who'd faced her worst fear and emerged not broken, but transformed. The night Ella Fitzgerald's voice failed, she discovered something more valuable than perfection. She discovered resilience. She discovered that artistry isn't about never making mistakes, but about what you create in response to limitation. She discovered that sometimes the most important thing you can do is keep making music even when the music you planned won't come. 300 people sat in a Los Angeles jazz club expecting to hear beautiful songs sung perfectly. Instead, they witnessed the birth of a new form of vocal expression. They saw fear transformed into innovation. They watched limitation become liberation. And Ella Fitzgerald, standing at that microphone with her perfect voice refusing to work, made a choice that would define the rest of her career and influence generations of musicians who came after her. She chose to keep creating. To use what she had rather than mourn what she'd lost. To turn disaster into discovery. The note should have been effortless. And when it wasn't, when her voice betrayed her in front of everyone who'd come to hear her sing, Ella Fitzgerald did something extraordinary. She found a different way to make music. A way that had never fully existed before. A way that proved excellence isn't just about perfection, but about courage in the face of limitation. That's the real story. Not the triumph of talent that always works, but the deeper triumph of creativity that persists even when everything goes wrong. The story of a voice that stopped, and in stopping, discovered how to sing in ways the world had never heard before. And every time someone scats, every time a vocalist improvises wordless melodies with the freedom and complexity of a jazz solo, they're using a technique that was born on that October night when Ella Fitzgerald's voice failed and she had to choose between giving up and creating something entirely new. She chose creation. And music has never been the same.